Okay, thanks very much. I'm going to talk on the, let me move this out so it doesn't block everybody's view, on really comparing seafood to other sources of food in terms of sustainability. So as we've heard, there's lots of concern about the sustainability of fish and other foods. And so I want to just go through what was currently known about the relative environmental effects and the relative sustainability of different foods. Okay, let's see, make sure that, okay. So first we need to think about what do we actually mean by sustainability. It's a very ill-defined term that can mean very different things to a number, to different people. And I'll talk about some of that. The first level is simply, can the food production system continue into the foreseeable future? That is, for a fishery, can we continue harvesting shrimp in the Gulf of Mexico, pollock or salmon in Alaska, herring in New England, whatever, lobsters in Maine, forever? Are we maintaining the productive capacity of those systems? And the same thing through crops. Can we continue growing beef in the United States? Can we continue corn, soybeans, etc.? Then the next issue, where it gets more complicated, is the production of food negatively impacting the environment? And the answer is yes. Almost every form of food production has some environmental impacts on the environment. And I'll talk about that quite a bit more later. And then finally, is the production system socially and economically viable? That it's often said that sustainability has three legs. There's the biological sustainability, there is the social sustainability, and the economic viability, sustainability. I'm not going to talk about those aspects much. They're pretty tricky ground, actually. So if we talk about the sustainability of world's fisheries, sort of the standard reference is this figure from the Food and Agriculture Organization, the United Nations, that classifies global fish stocks into three groups: underfished, maximally sustainably fished, and overfished. And what we've seen globally since the 1970s is a growing proportion of stocks classified as overfished. Now, this is where I have some disagreement with FAO. They consider anything that is overfished unsustainable. Now, that depends upon your view of sustainability, but certainly you can have stocks that are overfished and continue to be overfished for generations. Overfished simply means you're not maximizing the potential yield. So I think they're a bit unfair to refer to all stocks that are overfished as unsustainable. But that's, as I say, there's a lot of give and take on this. Now, we know a lot about the status of fisheries, specifically in many countries that do intense fisheries management. And this is a map of the major fishing countries of the world, and the size of the circle is how much of the catch of those countries is scientifically assessed. So we know its status. And what you see is that for most of the developed world, certainly Europe, North America, the big fishing countries of South America, we have Japan, New Zealand, we have a pretty good idea of what's going on with their fish resources because they do scientific assessment of those resources. The big gap in our understanding is South and Southeast Asia. FAO relies on these scientific assessments for the area shaded in green, and they rely on expert opinion for South and Southeast Asia, the countries that don't do scientific assessments. But if you go back to this, this is the sort of the standard picture, and it is one of overfishing increasing over time, And it generates this perception that the abundance of fish stocks is decreasing over time. However, if you look at the stocks where we have scientific information, so that's, as I say, dominantly Europe, North America, the big fishing countries of South America, the picture is very different. If you follow the blue line, this is the abundance of fish across all, average abundance across all of those stocks. And what you see is there certainly was a decline from about 1970 to the mid 1990s, but starting in the mid 1990s, the average abundance has turned around. So in fact, for the countries that manage their fish stocks, the abundance of fish is going up, not down. Now, the orange line or dots are the fishing pressure, and you see it was increasing up to the mid 1990s and then started to decline in about 2000. And the result is that the abundance of fish stocks started to go up. So the story is really quite simple. As fisheries management started to be more intense and reduce fishing pressure, between 1990 and say 2005, the decline in fish stocks turned around and started to increase. Now, again, this is only for the places where we have good data, which is about 2/3 of the world's fisheries. We can't talk with this kinds of knowledge about those other 1/3 of fisheries, most of which are in South and Southeast Asia. But there are still lots of questions about the overall sustainability of fisheries. And my perspective on this was focused on one event that happened in 2010. I happened to be doing some work in Africa in Serengeti National Park. And this fellow here, Marcus Borner, who was the head of conservation programs for the Frankfurt Zoo, which is a very big NGO active in Africa, he showed me the cover of Time magazine from November of 2009 about the classic popular story about the oceans being emptied of tuna. In this case, he said, "I'm a conservationist, should I stop eating fish?" And I took that as a serious question. I said, "Well, Marcus, if you don't eat fish, what are you going to eat?" And this is the question that the critics of fisheries never seem to ask, okay? And I want to concentrate on it. He said, "Well, I'm not a vegetarian. I would eat more chicken, beef, and pork." So I then really started to focus on understanding, well, what's the relative environmental impact of catching and processing fish compared to other forms of food, particularly other livestock, but getting a little broader. And if you think about what are the environmental impacts of food production, and that's where most of the criticism of American, Canadian, European fisheries comes from. It's not the sustainability of the target species, it's the environmental impacts. And different kinds of food production, they pretty well all produce greenhouse gases. Some require a lot of water. Many generate a lot of pollution, both particularly fertilizer and pesticides. Some livestock, some forms of fish farming use a lot of antibiotics. Almost any form of crop production causes soil erosion, and almost all food production leads to some form of biodiversity loss. So what's the relative impact of fisheries compared to those things? So we put together, this is now a few years, three years old, an analysis of that, just comparing animal source foods, that is capture fisheries, aquaculture, and livestock. And this is an example of the kinds of results. This is for the greenhouse gas, and it's the amount of greenhouse gas generated by producing one serving. That would be 40 grams of protein, which is more or less the recommended daily requirement. And this is the kilograms of carbon per 40 grams of protein produced. And you see enormous differences. In blue is capture fisheries, and they're highly variable. In fact, capture fisheries and aquaculture are both very variable. Some fisheries, particularly invertebrate fisheries, have very high greenhouse gas footprints. Some fisheries such as small pelagic fisheries, have very low greenhouse gas footprint. In fact, the lowest greenhouse gas footprint of any animal source food is small pelagic fisheries, herring, anchovies, mackerel. Whitefish are reasonably low. In the farming world, farm mollusks are particularly low. Farm salmon are actually particularly low. But let's talk about biodiversity loss, because that's really, you know, if you're in the fish world and you look at what fisheries are being criticized about, it's mostly biodiversity loss. And I want to emphasize, again, we always have to ask, what's the biodiversity loss associated with fishing compared to other forms of food production? First, croplands cover almost all of the world that it is possible to grow crops in. That's all these spots in orange. And all the spots that aren't in orange are typically grazing land, with three exceptions: the polar ice caps, the northern forest across most of northern Asia, Europe, and North America. Tropical rainforests. You see big gaps and also large desert regions. But most of the Earth's surface is devoted to food production. This is my friend and colleague, Tony Sinclair, who has compared the abundance of biodiversity inside and outside of Serengeti Park. And it actually turns out to be one of the very few studies that have done this. And what he finds is that outside the park, which is essentially small-scale farming, almost every form of biodiversity is almost gone. Herbs and grasses are down by 90%. Trees are down by 80%. Ungulates are down by 99%. Insects are down by 80%. Insectivorous birds are down by 90%. Mammalian carnivores are gone. Raptors are down by 90%. The only thing that's more abundant in farmed areas is rodents. And that's really, I would say, the best summary of what crop production and, to a great extent, grazing do, is they have enormous impacts on the ecosystem. In comparison, when you look at what's the impact of fishing on ecosystems, and this is a graph from 26 studies done by Beth Fulton from CSIRO in Australia, and we're going to look just at trophic level. So trophic level 1 is the plants, and fishing really doesn't affect the plants. Trophic level 2 is the grazers, the equivalent of the wildebeest in the Serengeti. This is the zooplankton. They're actually a little bit more abundant in fished versus unfished areas. And the third trophic level, that's your forage fish, are really about the same. That the only big difference in the ecosystem structure of marine ecosystems is at the highest trophic levels, where we tend to fish pretty hard. Now, I'm going to point out, I'm not the first person to highlight this. This is a very useful book by Andy Sharpless, who's the CEO of Oceana, a marine conservation organization. And he wrote this book called The Perfect Protein, and it's about fish. And particularly, it says, what if we could provide a highly nutritious food without fresh water, without pesticides or fertilizer, without antibiotics, and without destroying natural ecosystems? And the answer is we can, and it's eating fish. Just to close, I want to point out what farming does. And I also want to point out that I have an interest in this. My son, this is my son, is a farmer. At the time this picture was taken, I actually owned this farm. And what is he doing? He is trying to eliminate trophic level 1. That is what growing crops does, is you replace a native grassland or a native forest with another species. In his case, it'll be corn or alfalfa. At the other end, you have organic farming. This is my wife, who ran an organic vegetable business, and everybody says, oh, well, that's very friendly. Well, this is what her organic vegetable field looked like at the beginning of the season. And every bit of the vegetation on that field was gone. And this is what that field looked like 100 years ago. It was temperate rainforest on Whidbey Island. So there's just no comparison between the relative environmental impact of growing crops compared to fishing. And that's my 15 minutes, and thank you very much.